Hello and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Christy Nuds. I am the editor of Food in Canada. On behalf of Food in Canada, Canada's only national food and beverage processing magazine, and the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology, welcome to Table Talks, where we bring you regular webinars that give you access to some of the leaders in the food and beverage industry. If you haven't already, please visit CIFST's website for a list of our upcoming webinars, which will continue weekly into June. If you are a member of CIFST, registration for the entire webinar series is free. Today's topic, I apologize. Today's topic is the future of food retailing with Sylvain Charlebois. I apologize, everyone. I printed off the wrong.
No problem.
Anyway, I'm sure many of you already know Sylvain. He doesn't really need an introduction, but we'd like to give him a formal one anyway. Dr. Charlebois is a professor in food distribution and policy in the faculties of management and agriculture at Dalhousie University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. At Dalhousie University, he is also the senior director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab and is the former dean of the Faculty of Management. Before joining Dalhousie, he was affiliated with the University of Guelph's Aero Food Institute, which he co-founded. While at the University of Guelph, he was also the Associate Dean of Research for the College of Business and Economics. Known as the food professor, his current research interest lies in the broad area of food distribution, security, and safety. He is one of the world's most cited scholars in food supply chain management, food value chains, and traceability. Please welcome Dr. Sylvain Charlebois.
Well, thank you very much, Christy. First of all, thank you so much to CIFST for hosting this webinar. During these challenging times, I think we've heard that many times over the last few weeks. We're into week 8, I guess, of this crisis. It's been overwhelming, interesting. For an academic like me, it's been quite fascinating, to be honest, because I don't think we'll ever go through an experience like this. But I want to thank CIFST for just giving us an hour to reflect on what's been happening in the food industry, from retail to farm gate, I guess. But also I want to acknowledge the fact that CIFST is giving a donation to Feed Nova Scotia. Food banks are obviously overwhelmed right now. There are many Canadians in need right now, and they're there to serve them, which is and so we should feel all fortunate to have food banks in our lives. So thank you so much for doing this. Yeah, COVID-19, I mean, it's hard to know where to start. There's been so much going on. Perhaps I can start with a report, our recent report, which was released yesterday. You may have seen it in the news. It was reported by the Toronto Star about how Canadians are coping with grocery shopping. What are they doing? What are they anticipating doing after the pandemic? The one thing we've noticed, of course, is that consumers are fearful. I mean, they are showing up at the grocery store. They have equipment. 30% of Canadians now wear a mask. Some retailers now are making masks mandatory now. Longo's is one. TNT is actually measuring the temperature of consumers walking into the grocery store. So these are things that we haven't seen before. Hand sanitizers are very popular. 42% of Canadians actually will clean their grocery packages once they get back home. And that's way more than we expected. So there's that. Of course, there's this whole issue of e-commerce. Canadians are trying to avoid the grocery store as much as they can, and so they are going online. And we actually have estimated that e-commerce has grown 4 times. So it basically has quadrupled. The traffic for food sales have actually quadrupled since the beginning of the crisis. And based on what we're seeing right now, we don't think it's going to stop there. We believe it's going to continue on the other side of the pandemic. People will, as the industry equips itself in getting better at delivering food to people's homes, we are expecting more Canadians to do that. Food delivery apps, more popular. We are expecting that business to grow by 70% this year as a result of COVID. So lots of things going on. Of course, beyond COVID, people are planning to cook. Well, they are cooking now. They are at home, and they're cooking, and cooking can be addictive because, first of all, you feel it in control, and secondly, well, you're saving money. You're saving a lot of money, in fact. And so a lot of people are thinking, well, after we're done here, we're still going to continue to cook because we've learned all of these recipes. But at the same time, of course, we're all social beasts and nomads. Will, when restaurants open again, when the economy recovers, will we stay in our kitchen? That's the big question. Before COVID, 36% of our budget was dedicated to food consumed outside the home, at the restaurant. So are we going to get back to 36% ever? My guess is probably. The question is when. When is that going to happen? And of course, it will have a huge impact on how food retailing is being structured, how food service is going to restructure as well. The one question I get a lot about the grocery business these days is related to how the food retailing industry will look like after COVID. It's hard to tell right now, but when you look at the economics of food retailing, which have changed dramatically, when you look at one grocery store right now, I would say that since the beginning of COVID, the cost to operate a grocery store has probably increased by at least 5, 6, or 7%. Salaries have gone up. Cleaning procedures. Now grocery stores are cleaner than operating rooms at a hospital now. Security guards, new protocols, arrows, the plexiglass, and all of these things are costing more. And when your profit margins are at about 1 to 1.5%, something's got to give. And so what we're expecting coming out of COVID for grocers is probably that you may actually see fewer stores, just because it's going to be more expensive to operate a store. And also you could actually see stores being converted as pick stores, for example, because e-commerce will require that support, that infrastructure. And that's what we're hearing right now from some grocers, looking at perhaps converting some stores into pick stores to support e-commerce and deliveries. So that's another aspect that we're expecting. In terms of SKUs, pre-COVID, it was an era of abundance and variety and choice and convenience, of course. And sorry. And frankly, really, with COVID, it just is costing more to carry so many products. The average grocery store carries anywhere between 10 to 15 to 20,000 products, food products. That could actually be lowered as a result. Costco is a retailer that is known to carry very few SKUs, about 3,400 SKUs at a margin of 15%. Costco won't be affected by COVID all that much, but we are expecting other grocers to be affected as well. So in a nutshell, that's kind of what we saw in our data collection on April 28th, and we reported these results yesterday. Of course, there was yesterday's announcements by the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau about the support for the sector. And I don't know, Christy, if you want to talk about that or else, but I'll accept any questions you may have at this point.
Yes, Sylvain, I think if you can expand on the federal funding that was announced yesterday and what that could possibly mean. Was it sufficient? Like, what's your opinion on that?
Yeah, so the Prime Minister was clear that it was a first step. It was a disappointing first step for farmers. If you only look at the amount, it was basically a tenth of what the Canadian Federation of Agriculture was expecting. So I can completely understand why farmers were disappointed, absolutely. And when you think about all of the programs that have been rolled out since the beginning of the crisis, $252 million to support an industry, a sector that represents more than 11% of our entire economy is a bit of an insult. But I want to move away from the amount itself and focus more on the portfolio programs that was presented yesterday. My expectations, to be honest, wasn't very high. It is a very urban-centric government, which really doesn't understand agri-food all that well. It understands agri-food through the lens of large cities and urban centers, and so that's why I wasn't really expecting much. But when you look at some of the programs that were supported yesterday, I was actually a little bit impressed, to be honest. So first of all, with dairy and milk dumping has happened for several years, and it's never been addressed. The difference between past years and this year is the volume. I think there's been in the news over the last 20 years, I think milk dumping was reported 6 times in the last 20 years. But this year was unheard of. We're talking millions and millions of liters of milk, and in yesterday's announcement, I thought that Ottawa really nailed it. Looking at the Canadian Dairy Commission, that is the mechanism that we have in order to better manage surpluses moving forward. So it actually have provided the CDC with a credit of $100 million to create strategic reserves for milk. But what I think needs to happen is more investment in processing milk so it can be preserved for several months, even perhaps exported. But of course, because of supply management, we can't really go there. But I think we should go there. So this is a first really interesting step, I thought, yesterday. Perhaps most people didn't appreciate that, but I thought, wow, that's a really interesting move for a government like that to make. So that's one. The other interesting move, I thought, was the money for processors. Food processing in Canada is anemic. It's in trouble. It was in crisis before the crisis started. In Canada, we have lost 12 jobs a day, every day, since 2012. And nobody talks about it. That's 35,000 jobs in food manufacturing. So going into COVID, we already had a very, very weak system. And it's very difficult to build an agri-food industry without a strong processing industry. If you don't focus, if you don't make processing the centerpiece of your strategy, everything will fall apart when you're facing a crisis like COVID. And that's exactly what's going on right now, because what happens is that it creates a bottleneck, and that bottleneck will create victims, and victims are most of the time farmers. Farmers are the ones stuck with the problem. And that's why we've seen over the last several weeks milk being dumped Pigs being euthanized, over 93,000 according to the Canadian Pork Council. This morning in La Presse, there's a report stating that 200,000 chickens were euthanized in the last few days in Canada. These measures are absolutely unacceptable. This is food, especially in light of the fact that over 4 million people have lost their jobs. It's not something we should be accepting. It's just waste. And I think we need to embrace or foster this more vertical coordination in the system. And you can't do it without processing. And so I'm hoping coming out of COVID, and I think this is what the government was trying to do yesterday, was to foster this thinking of vertical coordination, forcing everyone in the industry to think about each other. So problems affecting farmers should be problems affecting processors and distributors and so on and so forth, and vice versa. Right now, what we see is a highly divided, fractured supply chain. And when you go to Holland or Denmark, I spent a few years ago in Europe looking at supply chains. It's completely different. Why haven't we heard anything from meat packing plants out of Europe with COVID? Because they're well organized, because they're vertically coordinated, because they were ready. And we weren't, and not just in Canada, but the United States as well. And we're paying for it. So yesterday, I thought, was a bit of a mini signal in terms of what's coming after COVID. Of course, there was cash for livestock, interesting, 125 million. Big question mark there. How fast can we actually get the money to farmers? I have no idea. And to operationalize that program is going to be very difficult. You need to consult with provinces. How much money will farmers get? There was no detail. The last nugget that I thought was interesting and to a certain extent creative was the $50 million to buy surpluses, sort of a public buying program of commodities. Interesting concept, but how is that all going to work? Like, who's going to be making decisions? And $50 million at Farmgate, in the grand scheme of things, is not a whole lot. The Prime Minister said the intent would be to repurpose food to support the needy, like food banks, for example. But trade groups are already overly generous, like egg producers, dairy farmers. Some groups really are already giving a lot to food banks and non-for-profits. So I don't know exactly how that's going to work and which commodity is going to be prioritized, because a crisis will impact several commodities at once. And with $50 million, you have to make a decision. So I don't know how that's going to work. And there needs to be some sort of organization set up to manage this $50 million. And there was little detail. But I thought the concept was interesting. And I suspect that this really was for COVID only. But if it is beyond COVID, then of course you need to think about how is that going to be manageable, I guess. So in a nutshell, I would say if you're a farmer, I would be outraged by what happened yesterday. But I'm a realist. And I gave it a B+, to be honest, just because my expectations were very, very, very low. I wasn't expecting anything coming out of Ottawa for the ag sector, to be honest. So everything that I heard yesterday was a bonus.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Speaking of you mentioned a fractured supply chain. What can we do to move towards this vertical supply chain? Like, what sort of steps are needed, or what do you think, how can the government help, or what can the industry do as a whole? What can we learn from this, and how do we get there?
It's a good question. So first of all, we need to recognize that, as I said, your anchor is processing. And frankly, on many occasions, I've failed to see that. And I think part of the reason why we don't do that all that often in Canada, thinking about processing, is because from a government perspective, the government is not set up to recognize it. If you go to Ag or Food Canada, they're not thinking about processing. They're thinking about farm gate. They're thinking about farm gate policies. They're thinking about farm gate issues. And if you're a processor, you'll be sent to CIFST or somewhere else to deal with issues, or Health Canada. And if you go to Health Canada, they'll think about, well, the health of Canadians. And so that's a different lens. And if you go to innovation, well, they're dealing with all sorts of sectors. I've never been a big fan of creating a ministry of food in particular, which is something you see in parts of the world. But I think COVID is teaching us a very hard lesson in how we haven't emphasized much on this value chain approach. And to support that, perhaps it's time to really think about a Ministry of Food. I mean, the Canada's Food Guide is a perfect example of how Agriculture Canada, or its will, can be undermined, I guess, because we presented a guide, a food guide that was, from a scientific perspective, from nutritionally was perfect. It was based on sound science, but it wasn't at all based on our own food security reality. I mean, we don't grow nuts in Canada, not a whole lot, and we don't, a lot of things that we don't do in Canada, or we do very little of. And you could compromise the food security of Canadians if you actually are encouraging people to eat imported foods all the time, like the vegetables and fruits. And so I think there are combinations that are missing right now in government. So that's certainly one way you want to do it. So that's government. Industry, my goodness. Yesterday, in reaction to the Trudeau announcement, what did we see? We saw processors reacting, we saw ag groups reacting together, and that was about it. There were very different messages. In some countries, you actually have one trade group representing different elements of the supply chain. That's not what we have in Canada, unfortunately. We only have really a few trade groups here and there. The Canadian Federation of Agriculture will advocate for farmers. FCPC will advocate for manufacturers, and so on and so forth. They do talk to each other, of course, and they try to work together, but I don't think it's enough. I think more needs to happen. And there's no culture in Canada for value chains, unfortunately, and that needs to change. And I think one of the countries that does it very well is the Netherlands. The Netherlands have actually done a great job getting stakeholders to work together from farm gate to plate, and that's when you get into conversations about consolidation, concentration of processing. Like beef, for example, 75% of beef processing in Canada, federally licensed beef processing, is in Alberta, in one location. Is that what we want? Is that what we need? We all know that the industry's architecture is a product of what consumers want: cheap food. But the reality of COVID is that it is going to cost more. So we are expecting the food inflation rate to be at 4% in 2020, but that is likely to continue into the new year. Why? Because everything has slowed down. Everything is costing more to produce. You talk to egg producers, you talk to manufacturers, everything, they have to train people, they have to hire more people, they have to physically distance people. All of these measures are costing more. The changes you see in the grocery store are similar changes you would see up the food chain as well to produce. And right now, producers have to adjust their machinery because they can't really have workers close to each other as well. So it will force the entire supply chain to comply to new public health rules. And that is going to catch up to consumers. As consumers see their portion of their budget dedicated to food increase from 9% to say 10, 11, 12, 13% over the next few years, you're going to see a very different consumer. Will the consumer continue to want to just look at cheap food? Probably some consumers, but some consumers also will want to revisit their own social contract with the industry, and they may actually look at local foods. They may actually look at other types of food coming out of COVID. So it'll be very interesting to see exactly how the consumer psyche will work as the food inflation, the inflation rate overall becomes very low. The food inflation rate actually is very high. That difference between the two will be very significant. Well, it'll be interesting to see exactly how things will transpire over time as the economics of food change dramatically at retail.
Thank you. It's interesting that you mentioned sort of moving towards more local sourcing, or even on an ethical basis, consumers may start to think about. Do you think that's something that could help the industry rebuild or save on some of these costs or new challenges presented by COVID-19? For example, we've seen in the beef sector and processing that we're too reliant on a couple of plants. Should we be moving more to provincial abattoirs, or so that food manufacturers and grocery retailers have access to more locally sourced products so that there's less disruption in the supply chain?
I think so. It really depends on leadership. And I'll use one example, a project that I've been involved with for a couple of years now. In the province of Quebec, there's an initiative called Beef Quebec, Beef Quebec. And it revolves around a brand, Beef Quebec. And I've always questioned the infrastructure to support the brand. There are weaknesses there. But I suspect that COVID could legitimize initiatives like Beef Quebec, which is very small scale. I mean, Quebec barely has 80,000 heads of cattle. It's very small. I mean, you have some feedlots in Alberta with over 200,000. And I mean, it's ridiculous. So the economy, you can't really build economies of scale in the province of Quebec compared to what you would see in Alberta. But it does pose a very interesting question. I mean, is there potential for people to buy beef from Quebec with the label Beef Quebec at a higher price? Just because all of a sudden you see, well, yeah, a provincially licensed abattoirs are part of the food system, and it may cost a little bit more, but it's from here, or we know the supply chain, the oversight of the entire supply chain is assured, and the information that consumers are looking for is readily available as well. So there could be some of that. I know that in Ontario, there's always been this movement around cattle in the north, and this could actually represent an opportunity for them too. And so as you start thinking about all these localized systems, all of a sudden you could end up with some successful brands or supply chains. I don't think Canada will ever turn out like Europe, where food economies are very localized in Europe. It's 500 million people in a very small continent. We're 37 million people in a very large country. So we are limited in our capacity to do what they do on the other side of the Atlantic. But let me say this. I mean, I think there's if we have ambitious leaders out there, they could think about supplying local markets with local products, but also export that knowledge elsewhere beyond. Why not? And frankly, in Nova Scotia, right here, I mean, we do a lot of good stuff with our agri-food systems that we don't share with the rest of the world. And I think we should. Same for Quebec, same for Ontario, the prairies. I mean, you got the mustard in the prairies, the bisons, you got lots of stuff happening there in BC as well. I was talking to some people in BC yesterday. There's so much greatness out there in the agri-food sector, but we don't sell it, and we always feel the need to do it for ourselves, which is unfortunate because Canada has so much to offer to the rest of the world, and not just for us. So I do think that we need to strike a balance. We just can't afford to just localize and that's it. I think we should expand and look beyond the horizon, beyond the borders of our country.
Thank you. That moves me into my next question. With grocers or retailers potentially having less product SKUs, and we know there's the desire for local or Canadian branded products, but what does this mean for new product development for food manufacturers?
That's a good question. I would say, essentially, I would say that it is going to get people to think differently. The problem, as I mentioned earlier, is that there'll be that pressure from retail. We don't see how the number of SKUs will increase. So there'll be that pressure and there'll be some rationing in terms of SKUs. But also, COVID is also creating more supply chain democracy. What I mean by that is that e-commerce is becoming more and more of an option for a growing number of consumers. And as soon as you allow that virtual marketplace to exist, all of a sudden everyone has access to the consumer. Everyone. A couple of weeks ago, we saw Cisco Canada pivot and start selling to consumers. That was incredible. So Cisco Canada is a multi-billion-dollar business which exclusively sold to restaurants. That's it. It was a B2B business. That's what they do. And 2 weeks ago, because of the fact that restaurants don't exist and they were desperate for business, they pivoted and started to sell to consumers. Oh yes, you can actually buy 28-ounce steaks for $220 right now online through Cisco Canada. That to me was a really interesting signal. We've seen farmer groups getting together to start thinking about setting up a website to sell to consumers directly. I've seen processors, startups, farmers markets going online, selling food to people in city centers, delivering food to people in city centers. As soon as you blow things up and you go beyond our oligopoly, let's face it, at retail, everything is possible. So as you see less choice in a grocery store, up the food chain, you may actually have access to more choices also, which goes to your question about innovation. I actually do think that because of COVID, you're actually giving a legitimate chance to innovators out there to commercialize any products because they'll have access to the marketplace without being at the mercy of listing prices, being at the mercy of an address, being at the mercy of the mechanics of food distribution in Canada. And then, of course, you can go to the States, you can go beyond that. So it's very interesting to see how things are unfolding right now. And I mentor startups all the time. I mentor startups in Montreal, in Toronto, and Calgary. And that's the kind of conversations we're having right now in terms of commercializing some of these novel products. Do we really need to go and sit down with some grocers, or can we just figure out how to sell our products on our own without a retail store? Malls are closed now, so it's forcing everyone to think differently about access and distribution. So I actually think there's going to be more opportunities for innovative products than less. It's not going to be filtered through or filtered by grocers, I guess. Grocers won't necessarily dictate what you should be eating or what kind of products you should have access to. E-commerce will, which actually makes things very interesting. That buffer, that virtual marketplace is going to make things very interesting because benchmarks are going to change. Monitoring cells are going to be more different. Even in food service, I mean, we're thinking about ghost kitchens, right? People can set up ghost kitchens in suburbia, and why not having farmers invest in a ghost kitchen and sell meals through Uber Eats or Skip the Dishes or Grubhub? Why not? And you buy a dish, you buy meals from the farm. How neat is that? I mean, there are a variety of possibilities because of COVID, I think.
I agree. Thank you. But that brings me to another question. In this new world, first of all, do we have the infrastructure for the e-commerce? I mean, we know that some, major retail chains have had some issues. They had already had e-commerce, grocery shopping available. Now, part of that is due to demand, but how do you see this rolling out? Like, what do we need as an industry to work cohesively towards this? And what, if any, are like food safety implications, or how would the CFIA start to regulate this in the future? World.
you know the industry, yeah. It's complicated. Of course, it's complicated. I would say the one thing that I've noticed is that we have a very rigid system in Canada with zero flexibility. And that needs to change. We talked about provincial licensed abattoirs versus federally licensed abattoirs. In a time of crisis, I mean, why not allow provincially licensed abattoirs to export outside of the province? And why not? But of course, we know why, but why don't we look into these kinds of possibilities? And but everything has to fit into some sort of a box in Canada, right? So you're a processor, you're a farmer, you're this, you're that, and there's no creativity. We don't allow the supply chain to become spontaneous. And in a time of crisis, you gotta be. I mean, I've been amazed by the food industry since day one of this crisis. I mean, we've seen a lot of great stuff. I mean, what we've seen in grocery stores is the result of a supply chain miracle, really. Because when you think about the heaviness, the structure, I mean, when I went into COVID, I thought, okay, let's hope things work, and but it worked out really well because I think the industry started to really work together. My concern is that it may not last, and so, like in terms of processing and distribution, I mean, that's where I saw a lot of and retailers. If you talk to friends over at the Retail Council of Canada, I mean, I've been really impressed by the leadership there in processing as well, getting everyone to work together. But like I said, there's still some disconnects, absolutely right now, especially between farming and processing. So yeah, my question is it going to last? I don't know. I have no idea. Hopefully it will, but I've seen other crises in the past, like BSC. Wrote a thesis on BSC back in 2003, and I was asked to be part of the 2012 XL Foods investigation at in Brooks, Alberta, when it was owned by XL Foods. Now it's owned by GBS. I didn't see a whole lot of changes there, like from a cultural perspective. Yes, you'll see investments here and there and some patchwork here and there, but not significant changes in terms of strategy. So we have a food policy in Canada, which is great. It's only $134 million. But now we need a strategy. And in order for that strategy to work, my guess is that it would need to be supported by a budgetary envelope of at the very least $10 billion. And that's what the agri-food sector requires, from farm to fork, to replicate what we've seen in the United States. And so with COVID, of course, you can see right now, I mean, the concern that I have with COVID is that it globally, you can see that Canada is falling behind because of the lack of support we're getting from Ottawa. Like I said, not surprised. That's kind of what I was expecting. But when you look at what went on in Europe, what went on in America, the support that agri-food actually gets is just outstanding. So each American is giving farmers $86. So far in Canada, it's been 6 per Canadian. So 6 versus 86 for COVID alone. So you can see that there's a huge difference in terms of how agri-food is considered as a priority. And so, but again, like I said, like with the government we have in Canada, I'm not surprised because priorities are elsewhere. But unfortunately, it's because it is agriculture and agri-food, we're falling behind. And so we need a strategy, and that strategy needs to be supported.
Thank you. That's a big job. Do you think that, organizations such as the Food and Consumer Products of Canada and the Retail Council of Canada and others should start to work more cohesively, or how could they approach that? And how could food manufacturers and product managers of companies be part of this? Like, how do we move the needle forward?
Well, I mean, we've seen several initiatives over the years in Canada, coming from the private sector, coming from the government, to come up with a strategy. It's not easy to do because you have different regions with different interests, and you go to the East Coast right here, fisheries are going to be a key issue. Whereas in Ontario, you barely hear about fisheries and oceans, and the reality, of course, is that 50% of the world population actually considers fish and seafood as their primary source of protein, and we're big players, but we're not necessarily a priority. And so, yeah, so you kind of have to really discuss what the vision should be for agriculture in Canada. And I'm not sure we can do everything with anything. We have to start looking at sacred cows. I mean, one of them is, I think, supply management. I mean, that's the one thing that needs to be improved, I think. There are other mechanisms. Agri-stability is another program that is irrelevant for many farmers. That's not helping. So we have lots of programs that are in place, but they're not helping at all. It's just patchwork. They're just band-aids, really. And so in a time of crisis right now, I'm not expecting a strategy, of course, but it's outside of the pandemic. I mean, what kind of strategy are we going to get? And this is going to be key, I think, for Canada. But we need to get out of this funk as soon as possible and look at how we can grow the sector confidently. We have farmers out there willing to really play a leadership role around the world. They're capable of doing it. We just need a sense of direction. And frankly, I think it should start by, I know that the government was planning to set up an advisory group in Ottawa to start things off. And hopefully that's still in the plans. That would be a good start to provide a home for a strategy eventually, with the right people around the table. And then, of course, you build from there. Excluding industry is not necessarily a great idea. I think it needs input, and that's what happened with the food guide, of course. You want input from science, from industry. You want to hear, and then of course you need to start prioritizing. What are we going to do? What markets we need to grow? What kind of food do we want to eat? What kind of food do we want the world to eat from Canada? And so on and so forth. But I'll go back to my initial message. If you don't look at processing, you're going to fail. So when I say when you're looking at processing, you need to look at innovation, labor, capital, the fiscal regime, of course, making it competitive, all the regulations that would impact manufacturers as well, the red tape, and so on and so forth. But those are all of the things that really would matter moving forward.
Great, thank you. Just want to remind everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. Sylvain, I'd just like to ask you a little bit and kind of move it a little bit to meal kit discussion. So now we're seeing that a lot of people are cooking more at home, or if they're not comfortable, perhaps, meal kits. Are you seeing a resurgence in meal kits, or do you think that, I know in the past they've been it's been difficult for those companies to take off a little bit. Do you see that changing in the future?
Well, that's a good question. I'd say, so there's been a couple of announcements the last week. Because of COVID, we barely hear anything beyond COVID, but for people in the audience who may not know, Sobeys announced its partnership with Ocado officially last week. So that program was launched last week, which is timely, of course. This is a partnership I'm going to be following quite closely. It's an interesting one. And secondly, Loblaws last week, it ran a few pilots, but it did launch its own meal kit program last week. And again, in the middle of a crisis, a pandemic, and a lot of people are at home cooking, but there is some cooking fatigue also. And that's how meal kits are starting to address this void. It's just a perfect product, to be honest. Most of these products are healthy. They take less time to cook. You can actually create habits, which is great. I think there's, COVID is actually going to be good news for the meal kit industry. You saw with Good Food, results came in, I think it was last week, and they were very strong. Unsurprisingly, their stock price is actually is moving higher. Again, not a surprise, but moving forward, I do think there's a couple of things that there's some headwinds for the meal kit industry. The first one is packaging. Plastics is a huge problem for that sector. And I know that with COVID, things kind of got really sidetracked in terms of single-use plastics, and people got back to plastics, and we saw grocers looking at this from a different angle. But it is going to come back. I mean, after we're done with COVID, people will start thinking about sustainability. In fact, actually, I would say that probably people will think more about sustainability because the economy just stood still for a while, which is, well, let's be honest, it's not a bad thing for Mother Nature, really. Mother Nature is appreciating what we're doing with the economy right now, and I think it will get people to think, and the narrative around sustainability will change, and people will reflect on maybe we should think about resource management differently, and so meal kit companies will have to think about that, and in a serious manner. So that's one thing, which leads me to the other issue about meal kits, and that's price. Uh, the economy is going to be struggling for a while, and there's going to be a lot of people who will be looking at prices very closely. They're going to become very price sensitive. And right now, we estimate that a meal kit per meal per person is at about $11 right now in Canada. And so, can a typical family afford a meal for $11.50 every day? Probably not. And so, that's why I've always thought that grocers like Loblaws are actually well positioned to do well in that space, just because they have the infrastructure already. Good Food had to build everything from the ground up, and that's very capital intensive, and they're paying for it now. They're doing well, but moving forward, I actually do expect grocers to do very well because they have the network, they have the infrastructure, they have the relationship with suppliers. I know that Good Food has had some issues with chicken and different ingredients over the last little while because of the pandemic. But grocers like Sobeys and Metro and Loblaws are well positioned to make sure that their initiative is well supported with a sound procurement strategy. So, and they could actually decrease the price. Anyways, I think the market will look for that, some discounting. There's not a whole lot of discounting going on, but I suspect that people will look for discounts moving forward, I think.
Okay, thank you. I have a few questions from the audience. Why has it been so difficult to introduce blockchain technology for the value chain? Like perhaps this could be a solution for everything being a little more cohesive. And what ties into this too is another question on automation in the processing sector. Do you see perhaps that increasing moving forward, given sort of the social distancing and the health regulations that are coming out from COVID-19?
Yeah, so I'll start with the second question because I think the intent is clear, more clearly defined. Automation, absolutely. I think, I mean, the pandemic will as expose a weakness. So we talked a lot about meat packing, but dairy processing has been fine. I've visited many processing plants in Canada. A lot of them are modern. We haven't heard a peep from them. There's barely any humans on some of these floors. You need some humans, of course, but too many humans, it will create a problem. And that's exactly what we saw in High River and other places. And so, absolutely, I think we need to think about automation very seriously to protect the integrity of the supply chain. And companies will think about it. But with a high volume, low margin environment, it's very difficult. And so that's why because of the economics of food pricing at retail and this influx of wealth coming into the system, perhaps it will get people to think differently about the architecture of of the entire industry. The blockchain question it's an interesting one, because actually, to be honest, I haven't heard much about blockchain since the beginning of COVID. It depends what the intent is, and frankly, blockchain is not uniting the supply chain. It could actually be dividing the supply chain. It's uniting in a way from the market up, because you're providing the market with the information and the rigor that the supply chain needs. But when you talk to farmers, they don't know how that's going to work, and they don't know why should they get in to this system at all. And of course, it makes them feel a little bit more vulnerable even. And if that's what, and I'm not sure that farmers actually want that. And when you talk to processors and distributors, they're wondering, okay, so how do we monetize blockchain? How do we make money with blockchain? And that's the question. I don't have an answer to. I don't know. Can you sell blockchain technologies at retail? Is there a market currency for blockchains? I have no idea. And so that's the trick. And I know that there are lots of companies out there offering lots of different solutions. And I think I get an email every 2 days. Before COVID, I was getting an email every 2 days about a new company that was starting on blockchain. And yeah, I see the need, but I don't see how it can work with the supply chain, and of course how it gets paid. So.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one last question. This is from the audience as well. We're seeing more food manufacturers using imagery of food manufacturing workers in their marketing campaigns. What do you think the impact on the public will be? Will we get backlash? And how do we create a better public appreciation for food processing as an essential service?
It's a good question. Like I said, I'm a big advocate for food processing, because there's not a whole lot of us out there. Of course, farmers, there's lots of cheerleading for farmers, which is entirely deserved. I mean, they do a lot of great work, a lot of work Canadians don't want to do, really. And in distribution, there's a better understanding of distribution and retailing, because we're all consumers after all. But we can't really, the forgotten child has always been processors, and we have to remind ourselves of how important that element of the supply chain is. What I've been disappointed in the last few years of how this processed food rhetoric has damaged the industry. People think of processed foods as being unhealthy, unwanted, undesirable, but there is good processed food. I mean, there's a reason why we process food in the first place. Is to increase shelf life, to make our harvest more efficient. I mean, there's an economic reason why we actually process food. It's for workers' equality. I mean, for example, in 1950, women spent 3-4 hours in the kitchen. They don't do that anymore because of food processing. We are able to actually allow everyone to have a shot at playing an economic role in our economy, which is great. So there are lots of these things happening that I think has been forgotten from a socio-economic perspective. And I hope that COVID will get us to think differently about that component that has been forgotten, that has always been forgotten, or at least for the last 30 years. And so, yeah, that would be my message.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Charlebois, on behalf of the Canadian Institute of Food Science and Technology and Food in Canada magazine, thank you so much for your informative and very engaging presentation. In lieu of a speaker's fee, CIFST has made a donation to Feed Nova Scotia, whose mission is to increase food security through food distribution, education, and collaboration. We ask that everyone please consider donating to Feed Nova Scotia or to your local food bank in order to help those in need during this difficult time. Before we sign off, I'd like to remind everyone that we are hosting webinars every Wednesday into June. Next Wednesday, we are pleased to have Dana McCauley from New Venture Creation Research Innovation Office at the University of Guelph, and she will talk to us about how food and ingredient companies should reevaluate their innovation pipeline after COVID-19. You can find a full list of the upcoming webinars at CIFST's website. If you are a member of CIFST, registration for the entire webinar series is free. Thank you for attending and enjoy the rest of your day.